Welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're getting into something really fascinating, often debated too, the Nephilim myth and how it connects, or maybe doesn't, with the biblical flood story. Our plan, like always, is to take the sources you've sent today, it's excerpts from Samuel Delgado's book, The Nephilim Myth, decoding the flood narrative, and, really pull out the key ideas for you. What you'll get is, hopefully, a much clearer picture of a pretty complex take on a familiar story. Maybe even some surprises that challenge what you thought you knew. It's about getting those aha moments without drowning in information, right?
Exactly. And the core thing we're looking at today, which Delgado really focuses on, is this tension. It's the difference between what people often call the angelic view of the flood and what the text, according to this source anyway, might actually be saying. We'll be digging into the problems Delgado raises with that angelic view based on the material we have.
Okay, let's unpack that. For anyone not up to speed, what is this angelic view? How is it different from, the standard Sunday school version of the flood?
Well, in the angelic view, the main reason for the flood changes quite a bit. Instead of it being about God judging widespread human wickedness, the primary purpose becomes eliminating these hybrids, the Nephilim. The goal, supposedly, is to preserve a pure human gene pool. Now, what's interesting, and Delgado points this out, is how this view gets sort of laid over the Genesis story. It forces these modern ideas, like genetics and gene pools, onto an ancient text whose original audience wouldn't have had those concepts at all. It's a very different framework.
Right, imposing modern science onto ancient literature.
Exactly. And the course also mentions that proponents sometimes see this as a positive. Like it helps them avoid confronting the very difficult idea of God wiping out almost all life. Delgado suggests it's presented as a way around that harsher narrative.
So Delgado is framing it almost as a kind of theological detour to sidestep a difficult part of the text. That's quite a perspective from the source. Okay, so that immediately brings up problems, doesn't it? Let's get into the challenges Delgado raises. The first one seems like a massive practical issue. If the whole world was supposedly filled with these hybrids, how did Noah and his sons find wives who weren't hybrids?
That's precisely the first major hurdle Delgado highlights. It becomes incredibly unlikely, maybe even impossible, within the angelic view's own logic. I mean, think about it. If the world is overrun, genetically tainted, then Noah's daughters-in-law have to be purely human, which means their parents had to be pure and their grandparents.
Okay.
And if they weren't sisters, you're talking about three entirely separate, uncorrupted family lines somehow existing amidst this supposed total corruption.
And who weren't killed in the flood, somehow.
Right. And then the question is, if genetic purity was the point, why weren't any other members of these supposedly pure families saved? It just doesn't quite track logically, according to Delgado.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty big hole in the theory.
And this often ties into how Genesis 6.9 is read, where it says Noah was perfect in his generations. Proponents of the angelic view jump on perfect and say, see, genetically perfect, like an unblemished sacrificial lamb.
Okay, I've heard that interpretation.
But Delgado pushes back on that. He clarifies that, yes, the Hebrew word tamim can mean physically unblemished for an animal sacrifice. But when it's applied to a person in Scripture, it consistently refers to their moral character, their integrity.
So context is key.
Absolutely. The verse itself says Noah was just and walked with God. That points directly to his character. And if you look at, say, Leviticus 22, it lists specific physical flaws for unfit sacrifices, blindness, broken limbs, scabs, things like that.
Well, not exactly genetic markers.
Not at all. Delgado argues the original author and audience had zero concept of genetics or DNA. If the text meant genetically pure, wouldn't it have had to explain that in terms they understood? Or use different language? So the conclusion from the source is that Noah's family was saved because of his righteousness, his relationship with God, not because they were the last genetically pure humans.
That makes a lot more sense contextually, defining perfect by character, not some anachronistic idea of genetics. Okay, so if we accept that, it leads straight to the next massive problem for the angelic view, right? Which is, if the flood was meant to wipe out the Nephilim, why are there Nephilim after the flood? Numbers 13, for instance.
Exactly. You've hit what Delgado presents as the real Achilles heel of this whole interpretation, the post-flood Nephilim. If the flood's purpose, in this view, was hybrid eradication, then their reappearance means, well, it failed.
So how do they explain that?
Proponents have come up with a few theories, and Delgado critiques them pretty strongly. He outlines three main ones. Theory A. One of the wives on the ark, usually Ham's wife is blamed, carried the corrupted gene. But Delgado asks, if preserving purity was the absolute goal, why would God or Noah let someone tainted onto the ark? Knowingly or unknowingly, it undermines the whole supposed purpose. Seems like a massive oversight.
Okay, what's theory B?
Theory B is a second incursion. Another group of angels decided to do the same thing after the flood. The problems here are pretty obvious, according to the source. First, why would angels who didn't rebel the first time suddenly do it after seeing the massive judgment on the first group? It seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, doesn't seem like great timing.
And second, if it could happen again, what stops it happening a third or fourth time? It makes the flood look completely ineffective as a solution to that specific problem. Raises questions about God's control, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, theory C.
Theory C. This is the one Delgado calls the most absurd. It's the idea that some Nephilim actually survived the flood itself.
Survived. How?
The explanations get pretty wild, apparently. UFOs, hiding on high mountains, finding refuge in hollow earth theories, underwater bases, caves, you name it.
Wow.
Delgado just points straight to Genesis 7, verses 21 to 23. It's explicit. And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures, and all mankind. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark.
Pretty unambiguous.
Very. Delgado notes the text says all flesh died. It doesn't mention hybrids or Nephilim specifically among the dead, but the universality is clear. No survivors outside the ark. So this third theory directly contradicts the scriptures supposedly interpreting.
Okay, so flying saucer Nephilim are probably out. It does seem like these explanations create more problems than they solve, so connecting all these threads. What does Delgado say this means for the bigger picture? For, like, the flood success and even how we view God's nature?
Well, this is where the critique becomes quite profound. Delgado argues that any of these second incursion or survival theories from the angelic view's perspective inevitably renders the flood a failure.
A failure.
Yes, if its primary goal was wiping out hybrids and hybrids reappear or survive, then the goal wasn't achieved. It paints a picture, Delgado argues, of God being potentially powerless, careless, or incompetent, unable to achieve his stated objective, or even allowing corrupted genes onto the ark he commanded built. It creates a contradiction.
That's a really stark conclusion.
It is, and Delgado goes further, challenging the underlying idea, often present in the angelic view. This notion of God being locked in a kind of cosmic war with Satan, where Satan is constantly trying to thwart God's plans via genetics.
Right, the whole Satan trying to corrupt the bloodline idea.
Delgado points to scriptures like Psalm 103 and Hebrews 1, which consistently portray angels, all angels as servants, ministering spirits who ultimately obey God's commands or operate within his sovereign permission. Even rebellious angels, like the lying spirit in 1 Kings 22 or the distressing spirit sent to Saul in 1 Samuel 16, they're still depicted as instruments used within God's broader purposes. They're adversaries to humanity, yes, but not equal adversaries warring against God himself.
So the idea of them successfully outwitting God
And surviving a judgment like the flood, Delgado finds completely absurd and fundamentally unbiblical. It suggests God's judgment isn't final or effective.
Okay.
So, to sum up Delgado's position, while the angelic view might offer, an engaging narrative for a movie, it ultimately creates a contradictory picture. It presents a God who seems neither totally just in judging all human wickedness, if he was only after hybrids, nor fully sovereign or capable, since the supposed main target of the judgment persists afterward.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to take in. We've definitely taken a deep dive into Samuel Delgado's critique of this angelic view. We've looked at the inconsistencies he raises about Noah's family, the huge problem of post-flood Nephilim, and these really significant implications for God's nature and whether the flood even worked, according to that specific interpretation.
It really underscores how important it is to critically examine interpretations, especially when they bring in modern concepts like genetics and potentially impose them onto ancient texts. It pushes us to ask, are we reading the text on its own terms? Or are we making it fit our own ideas?
Absolutely. So as you think about all this, here's that final thought we like to leave you with, something to mull over. What does it truly mean to decode an ancient myth or an ancient text, and how much do our own assumptions, maybe even ones we don't realize we have, shape the meaning we find?